Oh God, hear our story and help us to hear yours. Weave our stories together so that we may trust that you are with us as we emerge from comfortable places into a new future that you dream for us. Open our ears, our hearts, our minds to receive what you are saying to us, to respond to your gentle nudgings and your fervent shoves. Give us courage and faith and hope. In your name we pray. Amen. Yesterday, my son Graham had a really cool opportunity. He and some other members of his high school marching band were invited to come to Maryland Day at the University of Maryland and to play in their marching band for a red and white football scrimmage. So early in the morning, he got up and he donned the University of Maryland colors of red and black and went over to the campus to rehearse, and then they set up their drum line in the football stadium. He said they played through the whole game, some familiar stand tunes that he already knew, like Seven Nation Army, because every football game has that, right? Don't you know this song? Dun, 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 dun. Okay, you're with me now. And they learned some new music as well. And Graham had a blast. And so I asked him last night, do you think that you might want to play in a big marching band at a big university like the University of Maryland? And I said, yeah, Mom, I think I might. Which made this band mom super happy. Their high school band director had encouraged the students to take advantage of this opportunity so that these young musicians might be able to envision for themselves what it would be like to continue to play in a big college marching band. So that they would have the experience of playing in a vast college stadium in front of a big crowd. And he had done something similar for the middle school kids too. Earlier in the year, inviting them to come to the high school stadium to play in a high school football game marching band. I think this is such an incredible recruitment strategy. Because for a 12-year-old, I think it would be really intimidating to play with a bunch of high school students at a high school football game. And for a high school freshman to go play with a bunch of university students at the University of Maryland on their drum line. But for these kids to get just a taste, to have an invitation to see themselves in the future, this possibility starts to feel more real. I think we can all relate to this experience of trying something new, right? The anxiety of doing something for the first time, or trying to envision ourselves in a new environment, doing a new thing around different groups of people, being in an uncomfortable space for the first time and branching out of our comfort zone. This is a season of change in our lives, in our congregation. I know that many of you are on the verge of doing new things. We have folks who are ready to move to new cities, to graduate, to start new jobs, who are entering a new stage of their life. We have folks who are adapting to a new diagnosis or adjusting to the loss of someone or something. All of us, all the time, are making changes, trying to adopt new habits and new patterns in our life, and taking a step towards a new and imagined future. That first step can be really hard. But if we can visualize it, if we can imagine what it feels like, then maybe that change can be just a little less daunting. In these post-resurrection encounters with Jesus, the disciples are all about stepping into a new reality. And although he had been preparing them for some time about what was to come, this new reality beyond death and in new life and the resurrection. No matter how much he told them and tried to prepare them, they still didn't fully know what was coming. And although the Gospels were written many decades after Jesus' life, death, and resurrection, these Easter stories and these post-resurrection appearances are included for us, for our sake, so that we who came well after those folks who had that first-hand experience of Jesus can start to recognize this new reality too. And in most of these stories, the disciples, well, frankly, they appear traumatized. They're afraid and they struggle to remember what Jesus had said, and everything seems to come as a surprise to them, including the story of so-called doubting Thomas. Now, this story singles out this one disciple, Thomas, the twin, for someone who had some serious questions about the resurrection. But I think what we often overlook is that the rest of the disciples, who had seen the risen Christ just a week before, who had been present for his appearance and had received the gift of the Holy Spirit as he breathed upon them, they're still, a week later, locked up in the same room. They had an experience of the living Lord, but they haven't managed to budge from this safe hiding place. Because moving forward into something new, it's hard, even when we know that it's possible. And Thomas, being a first-century Jew, he was likely not doubting in the same way that we postmodern people might have doubts about the resurrection. A person of his time and place would have been familiar with accounts of miracles. And after all, he had been following Jesus for quite some time. He had been witness to some pretty miraculous things. And in Jesus' time, people lived in a culture that was more accepting of miraculous and unexplained things, of theophanies and encounters and experiences with God. They were accepted in a way that's perhaps more possible than we tend to question. So I think that Thomas's doubt in this passage is not about the scientific proof of the bodily resurrection, but about whether this appearance of God, of this holy, divine being, was actually the same Jesus of Nazareth. His friend, his Messiah, his teacher. Was this the same Jesus that he had known, that he had been following? Thomas wanted to have the same experience of the living Christ that the other disciples had. Not so much because he needed some undeniable proof of the resurrection, but because he longed to have a reconnection with Jesus, the one that he loved. He too wanted to be able to see him, to touch his wounds, to experience his resurrected body and this new reality so that he might have hope, not just for Jesus, but for himself. To believe that this new life was for him and for all of us. And in the story, it doesn't really tell us if Thomas took Jesus up on his invitation to put his hands into Jesus' wounds. But we do know that he was able to experience for himself the living presence of Christ. To enter into a resurrected reality that did not negate the scars of the past, but that redeemed the pain and showed him new possibilities. And it was then that he was able to believe. And the story ends with an invitation to all of us to believe even when we have not seen, to hold on to the hope of a new life that we don't necessarily need eyes to see. but that through a relationship with the living Christ, we can imagine into being. As the writer of the letter to the Hebrews says, faith is the assurance of things hoped for. It is the conviction of things not seen. Our resurrection hope is the vision of what's possible with God, that lives in our hearts and our imaginations, that fuels our work for justice and for righteousness. It is the longing for a faithful future that keeps us moving and working for a kingdom here on earth, the likes of which have never been seen. And this is where our faith starts to take on flesh, when we can envision what true justice for all looks like, when we can imagine safety in our communities, when we can imagine for ourselves peace in our families and in our homes, when we can conjure a picture of the end of gun violence and poverty and systemic racism, when we can envision a church where queer folks' lives are seen and celebrated as part of God's beautiful and diverse creation. We have glimmers of hope for these things, this resurrected life, because we have seen signs of how they might come to be. We know a different future is possible because we have been witnesses to miracles, to the experience of life overcoming death. We hold on to hope that God's justice, God's peace, God's reign can come in its fullness to all. This past week, we started a series of learning sessions about bridge housing. And we did this so that we as a community might learn more about what this is and why it's needed and how it works. And so we can continue in our discernment about whether this might be something we're called to partner with Georgetown Ministry Center to do here in Georgetown. And so on Wednesday night, we gathered together on Zoom, and we heard from two folks who have been doing this work in DC over the past couple of years. Folks who've been coming alongside people who are unsheltered and helping them move into temporary or bridge housing as a step towards permanent supportive housing. And our speakers explained that the idea of bridge housing up until a year or so ago was entirely new in DC. There was a vision for how it might work, but sometimes the reality, since it was new, was different. But they also talked about how important and necessary this step is for people who have been experiencing chronic homelessness, sometimes for years, in order for them to adjust to the reality of living inside again. Rebecca Farrer from Community of Hope explained how some people who have been living outside have difficulty adjusting to just being under a roof again. How hard it is for them to give up the things that they have relied on, that have kept them safe while they survive on the streets. She said, it's easy for me to tell them, you're safe here. But the trauma of living on the streets can make that hard for them to believe. And so they have to come to that realization in their own time, as they experience the safety and the security and the support that bridge housing provides. And she shared with us the story of one transgender woman who, when she entered into bridge housing, was able to sleep for the first time in probably years. Because this woman finally had a lock on a door outside of her own room, so she could lock the door at night and sleep, not knowing that she would not be harassed or bothered or even assaulted. You see, sometimes it is in that room with the locked door that the beginning of peace and new life These bridge housing sessions are also really important for us as a community, as we try to envision what we might be called to do in partnership with Georgetown Ministry Center and our unhoused neighbors. As we hold on to a hope for a more just and safe community for all of God's people. As we try to make visible for ourselves something that is new and different and unfamiliar, we need to be able to picture it for ourselves. And at the end of these learning sessions, I want to confess that we may still have questions, or doubts, or even worries about how this might all work. And that is okay. Because the goal, I think, is simply for us to be able to see the need and the opportunity that is before us, and to have a clearer picture of what it is that God might be calling us to do. I think if we can start to see the powerful transformation that this ministry could have on people's lives, perhaps that hope will lead us to step out in faith and to try something new, something we've never done before. And no matter how well prepared we are, my friends, the new, no matter what it is still scary. It's different, it's uncomfortable, it can be hard. And so I want us to go back to those questions that we had at the beginning of the service. Those questions that invite us to consider our metamorphosis as people of faith. Safe in our cozy cocoons, we wonder, does anything really need to change? While the world rushes on around us, we wonder, what if I'm not ready for whatever comes next? And when we fold ourselves down in order to fit inside an old container, we wonder, am I truly honoring myself by staying in this shape? When our worldviews are painfully challenged by new information, we wonder, could this discomfort indicate an opportunity for growth? It is then that the love of the divine reminds us, you too are my child. You can emerge to new life again and again and again. May it be so.